It is time for our hot takes, and today we're talking about former President Trump going after social media companies in court this time, filing a class action lawsuit against Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey, as well as Google CEO Sundar Pichai. The former president announcing that lawsuit in a press conference today, filed in the Southern District of Florida. Brian, I'm not sure I have a hot take on this necessarily, but in many ways, we have seen the former president muzzled. Essentially, we haven't really heard from him because he's not on any of these platforms. And so I would argue that this speaks to the power of these platforms, maybe a bit of irony going into this, seeing that you've got somebody who was kicked off the platforms who are suing the platform so that he can get back on it.
Yeah, and I think irony is the right word to describe this. We don't need to go into the nuances of what happened to President Trump on these, former President Trump on these particular platforms. But what we do need to recall is that in 2020, we saw the president try to revoke the Section 230 protections that were allowing these companies to skirt any sort of legal liability for content that's published on their platform. Now, of course, at the time, when the president was still the former president at the time was on those platforms, he was trying to advocate for protecting his freedom of speech. But after he was kicked off, now he's trying to sue not the companies, because he can't do that because the Biden administration revoked the 230 changes that the Trump had put into place. And now, because of that, he's trying to go around that by suing the CEOs themselves. But again, it just kind of brings around full circle that the idea wasn't necessarily to question the big picture of whether or not these large social media companies should be liable for the content that's on their sites, which I think beyond whatever President Trump at the time was posting on his Twitter account, I think is a valid debate. What we know now from this lawsuit against the CEOs shows that a lot of this was about his personal approach and the way that he was personally being treated on the platform. Now, of course, that debate about Section 230 it appears to have passed, but you do kind of wonder at some point down the line if it's not Trump, if it's somebody else that could bring that debate back up to the forefront of the big tech controversy.
Yeah, and if we're talking specifically about what this lawsuit is calling for, the president seeking immediate injunctive relief to allow his social media accounts to be restored. He's also asking the court to impose punitive damages on Facebook, Google, as well as Twitter. Now, you raised the issue of Section 230. Obviously, there's been a lot of debate in Congress about whether, in fact, the content or the platform should be held liable for the content. And it's interesting to see this discussion in the global context, because, yes, we have been talking about it in the U.S. here. But the other day, we saw India really cracking down on that, saying that Twitter is, in fact, liable for anything that's on the platform there. And so it's interesting to see how these threads have moved in tandem, regardless of which country it's in. And I think that points to the power of social media companies. Increasingly, a lot of these companies are saying, look, how much of it can we be responsible for? But when you have something like the insurrection in January, certainly going to get a lot of people to say, how did you not see that coming when all of the chatter was happening on Twitter as well as Facebook?
Absolutely. And you bring up the really valid point that this is going to be a different debate in different jurisdictions around the world. We were talking just yesterday about the issues that these social media companies are facing, tech companies at large, with some of the concerns in Hong Kong over that law of anti-doxing. Now, if you tried to apply some sort of similar law here in the United States, you do wonder to what degree the big tech companies might have a different approach to speaking out against certain laws or regulations, just because of the differing social atmosphere that kind of surrounds these types of issues. It just shows that the big tech companies, at least for now, if they were able to avoid the Section 230 debate, might just be inevitably kicking the can down the road for some other type of government run-in in the future.
Yeah, it does seem like a fragmented approach, though, doesn't it? I mean, you think about social media in many ways, it is about connecting so many people across borders, and yet you've got individual countries really trying to find a way to crack down on some of these platforms because of the speech that they believe has incited certain types of actions. Obviously, in Europe, there has been issues about content. It's been more about antitrust issues as it relates to these platforms. It's going to be an interesting discussion moving forward, just given the scale and scope of these platforms. You look at Facebook alone, I mean, we're talking about more than 2 billion users.
Absolutely. And that's a big reason why a lot of these big tech companies, they try to hire people that were in the government. You recall Nick Clegg, right? Obviously going over to Facebook, people were like scratching their heads at the time, but it makes sense that you can have those political know-how inside the company to deal with all of that issue. So obviously a lot to watch out for in that space, and we'll see if there are more headlines. I expect there will be out of that story.